Okay, for those of you who just joined, we're just waiting another minute or so and then we'll get started. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to our briefing today on pension plan design trends across the 50 states. I think this topic is very timely because state pensions have been in the news lately, mostly in a rather unfavorable way. As you probably know, Congress called out state pensions during the recent stimulus talks and actually prohibited states from being able to use any of their new stimulus funds on their state pension programs because they felt like they had been mismanaged. But we all know that's not the case across the country, and many of those states that have struggled in the past are working to address their issues. And we'll hear much more about that in just a few moments. So my name is Mandy Rayful, and I'm the director of NCSL's Fiscal Affairs Program. This is the 6th session of our 7-part spring fiscal briefing series. We've been covering quite a wide variety of topics, and they've all been recorded and archived on our website. Our final briefing is scheduled for next Wednesday at the same time, and it features a state budget and tax update. So we'll go ahead and post the link to the entire schedule in the chat. You can check those out. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge the Pew Charitable Trust for their support of the fiscal series and for their ongoing partnership with NCSL on state policy issues, including today's topic of state pensions. And then just a couple final notes from me. One, as I mentioned earlier, we are recording these sessions. So this will be recorded and available on our website early next week. And two, this is meant to be interactive, so feel free to ask questions. You can either post them in the chat or you can raise your hand if you want to ask directly, and then we'll also have time for questions during the program. And so with that, I'm going to turn the Zoom over to my colleague, Anna Petrini, who will lay out our agenda and kick us off today. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mandy. So my name is Anna Petrini. I'm a senior policy specialist at NCSL. I work on pensions and retirement issues, and I wanted to welcome today's distinguished speakers. Susan Banta and Alina Oberther from the Pew Charitable Trust are going to be facilitating the next portion of the program with an overview of recent market impacts on public pension fund investments, new research on public sector hybrid retirement plans, and other design trends in the states. So earlier in this fiscal briefing series, we had an opportunity to delve into how state pension plans have been faring during the COVID era, tools for measuring their fiscal stability, and some lessons learned from individual states as they navigate this period of economic uncertainty. Today, we're going to be exploring the challenge of balancing pension costs with the need to recruit and retain a skilled workforce, which has prompted policymakers in several states to review how they design public retirement benefits. So we are going to dive into some exciting new research on hybrid plan design frameworks and how to evaluate them, along with pension policy updates from legislative leaders in Kentucky and New Jersey. We are very pleased that we can be joined by Susan Banta, who directs research for Pew's Public Sector Retirement Systems Project. She leads a team of researchers that studies the funding policies, investment practices, governance, and benefit design of state pension systems. Before joining Pew, Susan spent more than 20 years advising governments on public finance, tax policy, and other revenue issues. We're also very happy to welcome Alina Oberther, who currently oversees the Pew team's 50-state research around plan design and retirement security. She has more than a decade of experience working on state policy issues. I'd also like to welcome Elizabeth Wiley. She is a consulting actuary at Chiron with 16 years of experience working with public pension plans. As Chiron's public pension coordinator, she manages the firm's relationships with trade associations, research organizations, professional bodies, and government entities. And she holds positions at several actuarial professional associations as well. We are delighted to hear from State Representative Ed Massey, who was recently elected to serve the 66th House District in Boone County, Kentucky. He currently serves as chair of the Judiciary Committee, and Representative Massey is also a practicing partner in the law firm Blankenship, Massey and Associates. He was a member of the Boone County Board of Education for over 21 years. And he has served as president of the Kentucky School Boards Association and the National School Boards Association as well. And finally, we are very pleased to have Kevin Drennan with us. Prior to being named executive director of the New Jersey Senate Majority Office, he served as chief of staff to Senate President Steve Sweeney. Kevin has extensive experience in economic policy and business. He was a regional director of governmental affairs for Cablevision Systems Corporation. And prior to that, he served as executive director of the New Jersey Commerce Commission. He was also lead staffer on the Economic Growth Transition Committee for Governor-elect Jon Corzine. So here is a hearty thanks and welcome to our wonderful panel of speakers. And with that, I am going to turn the program over to Susan.
Well, thank you. And welcome everyone. And thank you so much for joining us today and for having us to speak with you about public pension investments and designs. I'm Susan Banta from the Pew Charitable Trusts. I'm going to spend just a few minutes talking about the impact of the investment volatility during the pandemic on public pensions. To set the stage for my colleague Lena Oberther, who is going to be discussing plan design trends, particularly those that have been designed to mitigate the risk associated with investment volatility and other pressures on pension systems. She'll also be touching on some of the defining and measuring the success for public pension systems that Anna mentioned just a brief moment ago. And then we'll hear from Elizabeth Wiley, who will take a deeper dive into the hybrid plan design that many states are beginning to employ to build resiliency against market fluctuations. And then finally, we'll all be participating in a conversation with Kevin Drennan and Representative Massey on what's going on specifically in their states. So very much looking forward to that. So let me just very briefly discuss the situation, which I'm sure you've all become quite aware of as you've engaged in your own work in your states on what's been happening in the market. And this graphic provides a really quick snapshot of what we've been living through from the perspective of pension funds in particular, although obviously any market participant has been exposed to this volatility. So, immediately that jumps off the page, this 34%, 34% drop in fund value at the onset of the pandemic, followed by a pretty prolonged and steep increase in equity values. They're up 43% since the start of fiscal 2020. This has basically yielded a 5% return over fiscal 2020, despite that large loss in March, as well as returns during this fiscal year that look like they'll land at about 20% or more as we close out June and the fiscal year 2021. So a lot of volatility and a lot of good news for fund balance sheets. But we are anticipating, continued volatility, perhaps not this dramatic, but the market is inherently volatile. And we're also keeping an eye on an uncertain economic situation, which may be cause for concern. So right here, we've illustrated 3 different CBO forecasts. The blue line illustrates the
And I'm so sorry. We're not able to see your slides. Are you able to reshare your screen?
I am so sorry. That let me try it again. So very sorry. Is that better? Oh,
Perfect.
okay. So very sorry. So here's that volatility chart, which I've spoken to without showing you, but just to show that very dramatic downturn followed by that 43% increase since the start of 2020, with a compound return of about 21%. So as I said, very volatile, and we expect perhaps not this level of volatility going forward. Hopefully, this is kind of a once in a generation run up that we see since the end of March. But we anticipate volatility and, of course, continued economic uncertainty as we recover from the pandemic itself. So here we are on the second slide. The blue dotted line is the forecast, CBO forecast of economic growth from January of 2020, which is before the pandemic started. The orange line is the July forecast, after a few months of recovery in the market, but still very much a closed economy. And then in February of this year, the revised forecast is the yellow line. And the salient takeaway here is that GDP is not expected to return to pre-pandemic levels till 2025, according to CBO. Although if we have another surge in the pandemic or other economic disruptions, we may see something more similar to that July forecast, where there's a little more indefinite lag to economic growth. So that kind of gives us a baseline understanding of forecasts for the future, assuming different paths for the pandemic. And then finally, I just wanted to highlight the fact that even though we're in the middle of this, once in a generation market rally, expected returns over the long term are continuing to decline. And that's a trend that we saw before the pandemic. And it continues as we continue on in the economic recovery following the pandemic or following a relaxing of the pandemic. So for example, nominal GDP, it's now forecasted to be less than 4% going forward. Core bond yields, 2.5%, which is pretty significantly lower than what we were anticipating before the pandemic. And total pension plan returns, given a typical portfolio asset allocation, are now forecasted at 6% instead of 6.4% that we were forecasting before the pandemic hit. So again, pension funds are exposed to significant uncertainty going forward. And I'd like to turn the deck over to my colleague, Alina Oberthur, now to discuss how some retirement plans have been planning for that uncertainty in a way that sustains plan assets or fund assets and manages costs in a more predictable and affordable manner for the supporting government budgets. So with that, I'll turn it over to Alina.
Great, thank you, Susan. Good afternoon or good morning, I guess, depending on where you are in the country. So I'm going to highlight some plan design trends over the past decade or so, and then discuss how we define and measure success for retirement systems. So first, I just wanted to touch really briefly on a few definitions. So the first is risk-sharing features are formal mechanisms that share risk, such as investment or demographic or longevity risk, between the system, employers, and employees. Two types of plan designs that incorporate risk-sharing features are variable defined benefit plans and hybrid plans. Variable DB plans are when a traditional pension plan incorporates a risk-sharing feature, typically either a COLA or employee contribution, that varies based on investment returns or plan funding level. And then finally, a side-by-side hybrid plan combines typically a smaller pension with an individual savings account. And our next panelist, Elizabeth Wiley, will discuss hybrid plans in more detail. Next slide, please. Susan, next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So since the Great Recession, policymakers have been adopting variable DB plans and hybrid plans in order to improve their fiscal stability and make benefit costs more predictable. So as you can see in this graphic, in 2008, only 4 states offered state workers or teachers a hybrid plan, and only 9 states had a variable DB plan. But as of 2020, these numbers had grown to 12 states that offered a hybrid plan and 18 states that had a variable DB plan, which includes a cash balance plan design. Next slide, please. So as part of our 50-state research, we've begun to identify retirement systems that perform well in terms of both fiscal health and retirement security. As we think about and develop these measures, there are a few states that really stand out: Wisconsin, South Dakota, and Tennessee in particular. So while these systems vary in terms of design, demonstrating that there's no one size fits all, they all incorporate risk management features, which, combined with the extremely important good funding, allow these states to excel in terms of ensuring predictable costs over time. So when thinking about the best method for DB plans to incorporate risk-sharing elements into their plan design, our research has identified that adopting a variable COLA combined with a variable employee contribution is typically the best practice. The COLA in particular stands out as a powerful mechanism for reducing employer risk while minimizing the impact on workers and retirees. So for fully funded to close to fully funded plans, tying the variable COLA to funding level can work well. For example, this is the basis for South Dakota's variable COLA. However, for plans that are less well funded, the best strategy is typically to tie the variable COLA to investment returns, typically smoothed over a set number of years. So Wisconsin is a good example of a state that has incorporated both variable contributions and COLAs into their plan design. Employee and employer contributions rise and fall equally in response to market conditions, and the post-retirement benefits are automatically adjusted based on investment performance. Other best practices for risk-sharing features include predefined automatic rules. So for example, in South Dakota, if returns on investments fall short of expectations, the COLA policy is adjusted automatically to ensure that the plan remains 100% funded. And in addition, assumptions can be used to create a margin of safety. This is how the Tennessee hybrid plan works in part. They keep employer costs stable by calculating contributions using conservative assumptions. Next slide, please. So we've identified a number of principles related to the habits of highly successful retirement systems. These include retirement security, which we will discuss in more depth in a minute, and fiscal sustainability, meaning pension obligations are funded in an affordable and predictable manner, and intergenerational equity, where the full cost of benefits are funded the year they are earned. These 2 principles are closely linked to the concept of cost predictability. Next slide, please. So our research shows stark differences in predictability of employer contribution rates for different states, with some states having very stable costs over time, while others experiencing big changes over time. So this graphic, the blue bar shows how employer contributions changed between 2008 and 2014. And the orange bar shows how the blue bar changed between 2014 and 2008. So as you can see, for New York, the cost jumped around a lot during those 2 time periods. Well, in contrast, if you look at the 3 bars on the end, Wisconsin, South Dakota, and Tennessee, they stayed relatively stable between those blocks of time. So of course, much of this stable cost is due to states consistently making their full contributions across the business cycle. But we have also found that risk-sharing features play a big role in keeping these costs stable. Next slide, please. So to measure cost predictability going forward, we use a different metric, normal cost sensitivity. So normal cost sensitivity measures the expected volatility of employer costs for future benefits. shown as a percent of payroll under a low return scenario. So as you can see in this slide, the 3 states at the bottom, South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Tennessee, see 0 or small changes in their employer costs. So the little black bars represent the costs under the expected return, and then the yellow bars represent the range of costs under a low return scenario, which we use a 5% return. So Wisconsin, South Dakota, and Tennessee are either totally stable or have a relatively small range, where the 3 states at the top, New York, Washington, and North Carolina, show much more volatility under a low return scenario. Next slide, please. So now to return to the concept of measuring retirement security. So in order to look at how well a system provides retirement security across the workforce, we use 2 primary metrics. The first, the replacement income ratio or replacement rate, is the percent of a worker's pre-retirement take-home pay that is paid out by employer-provided retirement plan and, when available, Social Security. We also look at the savings rate metric, which captures the percent of annual salary a worker can withdraw upon separation, depending on whether employees have access only to their contributions or whether they can claim some amount of the employer contributions made on their behalf as well. When applying these 2 metrics to state and teacher retirement systems, we focus on systems where employees are covered by Social Security. Next slide, please. Replacement income helps capture how well career workers are set up for retirement, finding that in most cases, workers with a long tenure can expect their retirement benefit will match their final take-home pay. So this graphic walks through our several-step process for calculating retirement income using a sample DB plan, and finds a full replacement rate for the typical career worker once we've adjusted for inflation, included Social Security, and adjusted for take-home pay. Next slide, please. So while most plans have retirement security for career workers woven into their fabric, it's much more of a mixed bag for workers who switch employers. The retirement savings rate is applicable to workers who leave prior to vesting, as well as to many vested employees who leave when they are a number of years from retirement. So this slide shows the savings rate for 58 retirement systems that cover teachers and/or state workers. So for most systems, this rate falls well below 12%, and the average savings rate is about 8%. So as a result, many state workers and teachers who live mid-career have a level of retirement savings that falls well below what experts predict is needed for a secure retirement, which is typically around 12 to 15%, probably closer to 15%. So on this graph, the blue bar shows the level of employee contributions that workers have access to at separation, and the orange bar shows the level of employer contributions they have access to. So as you can see, nearly all of the high-performing states provide access to both employee and employer contributions at separation. And I know it's hard to see, but our 3 kind of example states are both have some of the highest savings rates. Wisconsin, Tennessee, and South Dakota are all clustered on one side. So while under hybrid and cash balance plans, access to employer contributions at separation is pretty standard, it's much more variable under defined benefit plans. However, we find that when traditional defined benefit plans offer workers access to employer contributions, the workers are much more likely to have a sufficient savings rate. Next slide, please. So finally, I'll touch on a few takeaways. So as Susan discussed, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed already underfunded state pension plans to investment volatility. And despite recent strong market performance, the long-term forecasts suggest lower market returns and a high degree of uncertainty going forward. The handful of high-performing states that we've touched on have demonstrated that public employees can be provided a secure retirement in an affordable and sustainable manner. And finally, while there is no one-size-fits-all, risk-sharing features, specifically a variable COLA combined with variable employee contributions, can help systems meet objectives around stable costs and retirement security. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Elizabeth Wiley.
Great, thank you. And I will share a screen as well. So thank you. having me today. Just want to talk a little bit more about hybrid plans in particular. Frequently, hybrid plans are mentioned as if they represent a single concept, but the plans that are hybrids are actually very diverse, and understanding this range and the features of them can be very important for addressing. So I'm going to briefly talk about this as well as a recent paper that I was one of the co-authors of. I think can be useful. So this is a report that I co-authored with the National Institute on Retirement Security, as well as Chiron, who's my employer. This was just released back in May. And in this report, we look at hybrid structures in the public sector, and it includes both specific examples and general information. I'm not going to go into too much detail today, but just want to provide highlights of a few elements from this report. So this first figure is from the report, and this is actually something that I designed trying to demonstrate the various structures that are in use in the public sector, because they can be pretty complicated, and so wanting to get some clarity as to what these are. So if we start at the top, it starts with the traditional DB defined benefit and DC defined contribution plans. In a traditional DC plan, the amount of the contributions that are made to a member's balance are defined, and then they have this balance to spend during their retirement. And this type of structure is shown in green in this graphic. And then in a traditional defined benefit plan, the benefit that is paid over a person's retirement is defined based on formulas in the plan. In the public sector, these are almost always related to their salary. And this type of structure is shown in blue. Now that we've established these two traditional or old versions, we can get into the hybrid types. The first group are single plans that are called hybrids, and these feature elements of both DB and DC. There's two types of these: cash balance and then DC plans that offer annuitization at retirement. These two types generally look more like a DC while you're working and then like a DB in retirement. One thing you can notice in the coloring here is that the cash balance plans have some features that make them a little bit more like DB, so it's a little bit more blue than green, but both of these are single plans that members are in that have both DB and DC elements, so truly are hybrid. And this is where that word hybrid came from. And I know many times people think of hybrids as these new thing that have come around, but one thing to be aware is that cash balances have existed in the public sector since at least 1945, so they aren't necessarily new. Then the second grouping are plans that contain separate DB and DC plans, and there's three types of these. The first, just shown on the left, the vertical hybrids, consist of a DB or defined benefit on salaries up to a certain level, and then they have a DC plan on all the salaries above that. Then there's horizontal hybrid plans, which operate in parallel. And with those, you apply both a DB and a DC plan to all salary of the members. And the levels of these plans are typically going to be lower than if they were standalone, since the members are participating in both. And then the third type is what we label as choice plans. And this is where members elect to participate in either a DB or a DC plan. And that's in contrast to the vertical and horizontal plans, where the members may be participating in both. Then the final category we talk about in the paper is DB, or it can be these other types of hybrids that are above plans that also contain features that are described as risk sharing, which Alina nicely explained and mentioned. And in these, either the cost or the benefits are going to vary with the experience, which allows these plans to be more dynamic and adaptable. The second part of the paper that I'm going to highlight today is this framework that we included in the paper for designing a plan change. And in reality, is actually more likely considering reforms to an existing plan, because there aren't that many new public pension plans coming into existence. There are some, but the majority of the time, it's looking at an existing plan and going, what sort of changes can we make going forward to better align with our goals. And while there is no perfect structure that's going to work for all plans, we suggest that there is a universal process that can be followed in determining the appropriate structure for a particular plan. In the paper, we go into detail in each of these steps, but I'm just going to talk about the high-level steps of the process. So first, it starts by identifying the objectives of the plan. That's essentially coming up with what are the answers to the question of why is the sponsor offering the plan and what do they want to achieve? You need to start from that place of why are we doing this at all? Then it's important to consider any limitations on the types of the features of the plan that are going to be offered. And these are going to be specific to each plan and sponsor. And then once you've done those two things, the next step of the process is to consider the risks that are faced when you offer a retirement plan and consciously determine how those risks are going to be allocated. Typically, the risks are either going to be borne by the members, the sponsor, and thus the taxpayers, or shared between them. And then once you're able to select the appropriate structure based on these objectives, limitations, and risk desires, and once you've done that, you implement the plan. And then there's a very important final step, and that is that you need to monitor that implemented design and revise further if needed. And sometimes there are unintended consequences that come from a structure, and so you're going to want to watch for those, as well as just, is the design you thought was going to meet your goals actually achieving it? So then the final piece from the report that I want to highlight it today is just a table that looks at these objectives that I talked about as the first step of the framework and considers how various plan structures succeed at achieving them. Now, I do want to note that this table in the report and shown here is done based on a typical plan of each type. So it's very important to be aware that specific plans of a type might achieve these goals differently based on the provisions of that plan. And the objectives that are featured here all relate to workforce management, which is essentially using the pension plan to support the desired 3 R's, recruitment, retention, and retirement of the workforce by the sponsor, as well as retirement security, and then cost considerations. And we believe that this table is useful not just for the general considerations about the type of plan and for getting an idea of what approach you might be taking, but you can also take this structure and idea and use it as a way to consider the specific structure that you're considering implementing. Because in that first column, all of the kind of features are things that would argue are important to keep in mind as you're contemplating any plan design changes or features. So the full paper, as well as a webinar that we gave talking through the research and things, are available on the NEARS website, which is nearsonline.org, and I'll drop the link in the chat as well. But we really hope that this is a useful resource for legislators who are considering plan reform. And I appreciate the opportunity to share this paper with you. And if there are any particular questions or things, I'd be happy to answer them. Thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you, Alina. Anna, does it make sense to roll right into our conversation with our panelists? Fantastic. So I will serve as moderator for a discussion with Kevin Durand and Representative Massey. Kevin, as Anna said, is from the state of Kentucky, and he, oh, excuse me, I mixed it up, New Jersey. Kevin is from New Jersey, and he's the executive director of the Senate, I believe, Majority Leader's Office, or Senate Majority, I'll just say. And of course, Representative Massey is from the great state of Kentucky, and was a driver of recent reforms in that state to bolster the fiscal health of their public pension plans. So thank you both for joining us. And I guess what I'd like to do is just start off by asking you both what your major concerns were as we entered the pandemic and realized, what we were in for in those first few months, specifically regarding the pension plan and its impact on your state budget. Representative Massey, would you like to start and give us a sense of what's been going on in Kentucky?
Sure. Make sure I'm not on mute. Yeah, before the pandemic even occurred, the pension problem in Kentucky has been well noted and has been a source of national news and state news. There were protests in 2018 that were highly addressed under a prior governor, and there was a real concern because of the ongoing unfunded or underfunded legacy deficit of about $14 to $15 billion. So when I came into the House in 2019, I came in with a background of having served on the Board of Education for 22 years and had a lot of familiarity with all of the people that represented the point groups, if you will, that would affect the pensions, the superintendents, the Teachers Association, the Jefferson County Teachers Association, the school boards, et cetera. So before the pandemic happened, we had actually made a commitment that we would try to do something with the pension. So in the midst of the pandemic, we were having regular monthly meetings with all of these stakeholders. And we started with what could we agree upon, did we have an appetite for, what did we not have an appetite for. And so we came up with the plan that was ultimately approved. However, I will say that in Kentucky, it should be noted that teachers do not pay into Social Security. So to some respects, we had to have a defined benefit portion to be a Social Security replacement plan. So we started, and the only thing we could come up with that everybody was in agreement on was a new tier in our retirement system for new hires. And so this will only affect teachers that came into the system or come into the system after January of 2022. But what it does when it goes to the recruitment retention piece is it gives these new hires some hope that they're going to be in a fully funded program. Because in fact, what we came up with was a hybrid that was a defined benefit, defined contribution program that allows, it'll be fully funded. The beauty of this program is that there's a trigger mechanism that if it ever falls below 90% funding, there is a mandate from the legislature that the retirement board has to take action in order to bring it up to the full level of funding. So it won't be back into the situation that we presently find ourselves in with an underfunded, unfunded legacy deficit of $14 to $15 billion. A lot of the ideas that were generated in that conversation were not just the legislative ideas, they came from the educators themselves, who realized that several years ago when Kentucky moved their retirement age down to 27 years, that was a mistake. So we actually moved up, and we did, if you can retire with 30 years of service, at age 55, you could still participate in this plan. At age 65, it's with 10 years of service. At age 65, with 5 years of service. So we made those adjustments, and we got buy-in from all of the supporting groups. The only group that did not endorse it, they didn't oppose it either, but that was the Kentucky Education Association. And I think that was based on a lot of mistrust that had developed in the prior interactions that occurred back in 2018. The potential for Kentucky is that over a 30-year assessment period, this will save Kentucky $3.5 billion. There's also projected surplus, which will be able to pour over to the underfunded, unfunded legacy deficit that currently exists. I guess the real concern for us as legislators is that we're waiting on an experiential study to come out here shortly. And the conservative estimate is to pay towards that underfunded deficit. It's going to cost our Commonwealth about $500 million more annually to pay down that deficit. So what's happening is with all of those pieces is that so much money is going to pay down that deficit that obviously other programs go without financial support. So we are very happy and very pleased with it. It's something that that took a year-long process from all the stakeholders. In the midst of the pandemic, we were still able to get this passed. It was a very important bill for us because it keeps us from having to deal with it in the next year's session, which is our budget session. And at least we're on the road to hopefully stabilizing our pension system. And then the recruitment piece is it has pieces in it that will be very beneficial to recruitment, including a portability factor. So if a teacher's in the system in the first 5 years, if they leave, they can still take the portion with them that they invested. But after 5 years, they can actually take the portion they invested and the portion that the state invested plus interest. So that is we found that to be very persuasive among millennials as we're trying to recruit. So we felt like it was a good fit for us, and we were very happy to get it through.
Well, thanks for that summary. I'm just curious if your expectation that you need an additional 500 million once the experience study comes in, has anyone factored in the recent kind of market windfall that we've all experienced over the last many months?
Yeah, we've taken that into consideration. Everybody's still very cautionary with that. And of course,
Fair
the way
enough.
Kentucky works, we have a 30-day session 1 year and a 60-day session the following year. What the pandemic did to us is that last year, since the pandemic hit us in the middle of session, what normally would have been a 2-year budget became a 1-year budget.
Right.
So in our 30-day session this year, we had to deal with the budget process again as well. So there's just been a cautiously optimistic outlook with regards to that because of the way it hit us during the session.
Great. Kevin, can I ask you the same question? And I know, just for everybody's benefit, we chose Kevin and Representative Massey as our panelists in part because their states are among those that were vulnerable before all of the economic troubles occurred with the pandemic. And so in New Jersey, I know that you all, like in Kentucky, have had an eye towards what to do with your pension system for much longer than the last 18 months. But tell us what's been going on in your state with both before and during the pandemic, and how that's changed your perspective and approach to fiscal sustainability of pension plans.
Sure. Appreciate it, Susan. Thank you. We're been fortunate enough too in New Jersey, especially in the Senate majority, to be working with Pew actually as we're looking and continue to look at the sustainability of our pension plans, and hybrid is what we're looking for. The state of New Jersey, prior to this year, and if we fund it in this year's fiscal budget, which we're negotiating at this moment, it'll be the first time we make a full payment since sometime in the early 90s. So we're going on a good 30 years we haven't made a full pension, actually required contribution to our pension system. And getting to a full pension payment, we will get to about a little over $7 billion annually is our pension payment going forward, and that'll even grow slightly. Of course, looking at the Pew report at a 6% rate of return, if that is accurate, that's very scary because our $7 billion at this rate is based on a 7% annual rate of return.
Right.
Certainly, we were very anxious going into the pandemic of what it could happen to the market. I think for many reasons, we've all been extremely pleased with the market returns and how they've done. Of course, it's that in and of itself is not going to be sustainable, which is what Pew, I guess, is indicating in their lower rate of returns in the outward years. Our number one thing as far as it's been related to the pension was we had a lot of double dippers. We corrected that in 2011, where you could have multiple public employee positions collecting multiple salaries and at multiple different incomes and how you would pay into it. And that got corrected back under Governor Christie with Senate President Sweeney, who's still the Senate President, and working on that. And since then, and what we've been building into prior to the pandemic and now is looking at, I guess, based on looking at the report, a similar stackable hybrid where we would do a defined contribution, defined benefit up to $40,000 and a defined contribution above that for our employees. And to the representative's point, it's great to have that level of portability. as well. And I think as we're looking into the future of what our needs are, that portability is going to be important. But the problem with all of this is, and even as you change it, the less money, as you know, putting into the pension system, the less money we are paying back for all the 30 years in which we weren't paying our full freight. And so, we're still analyzing the balance of that as we consider any changes to the pension system. And we have a non-forfeitable right in New Jersey for our public employees. And with the non-forfeitable right, it's hard to make any changes to existing employee pension plans, which means that we would have to do it for all newly hired employees, any of the changes that we do make. So it also creates a much slower change and transition. And so it takes us decades basically to even see the cost savings, even if we were to move to a hybrid plan. So we've looked at 2 other ideas related to how we can build assets and revenues into our pension plan. And the main 2 focuses we have, we're working on a program right now called the Retirement Infrastructure Collateralization Holdings Fund. And that idea is to take a look at what state assets we have, whether it's a turnpike, a toll road, a water utility, sewage utility, and looking at those and having those assets that potentially we can build revenue ideas off of that then bring in revenue straight into the pension system. New Jersey took that also between Senate President Sweeney and Governor Christie at the time. We did this with our lottery system. And so the lottery revenues that the state collects go now 100% to our pension system. And it takes up about $1 billion of the revenue that we need in our contribution go there. But the lottery was just the first asset that we've looked at. And we're looking to provide and see if we can do additional revenue options like I just said. And then the final thing we've been looking for a long time, and this is a long shot one, but we've been working with folks and trying to get Congress to look at this, but is what we would call a PIFIA, which is the Pension Infrastructure Finance Investment, whatever, but it's built off TIFIA and WIFIA. And with that, it'd be a similar infrastructure investment plan of which you would have to create some revenues. But it's similar to TIFIA and WIFIA. It would work like a loan fund, and we would be obligated to, pay back the federal government for that. And for a state in New Jersey, if we were to take on a level of assets and a level of responsibility through the PIFIA from the federal government with a commitment such as that Congress is considering for the infrastructure investment they have to make, we can take our $7 billion annual payment to about a $5 billion annual payment and make that almost entirely back to the federal government, but we're still saving $2 billion. And with that $2 billion, pick up a level of investment to Representative Massey's point, right? We have enough costs in the state of New Jersey that we're not funding because of all the money that we're putting into the pension system, that $2 billion, would open up the door to fund the infrastructure projects and probably some other much needed investment that we have throughout the state. So, it's those changes are all, whether it's a hybrid, the PIFIA, the RICH plan, those are things that the state of New Jersey is continuing to look at. The Senate President has been pushing now for many years. And just as one last plug on why we look at all this and why I've been involved from my position and where the Senate President is, he is the Vice President of International Iron Workers, and he runs multiple pension plans. So his expertise is in pensions. And so he's been looking at this problem since he came into the legislature in 2002. And we've been working on it fairly aggressively since.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And just, we've really enjoyed working with the senator's office. I never thought we would work in New Jersey, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, and it's been a great experience. And to Kevin's initial point, I think of all the states that were facing kind of this massive uncertainty at the very beginning of the pandemic, I think New Jersey had just committed to a very significant ramp up in their contributions. And as Kevin said, made their first actuarially required contribution in the most recent past. So the ability to do that in a global pandemic is something that is incredibly laudable, and congratulations on that in particular. Another question for both of you. And Kevin, I think you alluded to this also at the beginning of your remarks when talking about the projected 6% long-term return, is just balancing the immediate need of closing budget gaps for the pension with the need to consider long-term costs and liabilities. So and I'm just curious how the dynamic between, the immediate needs and the long-term kind of trajectory that you would like to see your state on, how you balance those two concerns as you deliberated. And maybe Kevin, if you could give us a real quick answer to that question from New Jersey perspective, we can ask Representative Massey to answer the same one.
Sure. I mean, real quick on that. I mean, it's, the balance to us that we're now addressing is, as we're making our full contribution, is that not making the commitment to the full contribution has a much greater cost, and we've already have experienced it, that by making any other decision than not to fully fund it is just not wise and will never be fiscally sustainable for the state of New Jersey, regardless of the other changes that we may or may not make to the system. We have to be responsible and make our fully contribution, because we just didn't do it for so long, and the debt is almost insurmountable, and we have the obligation to the pensions anyway. So even if the system went bankrupt, we would still have the obligations to pay out to our public employees their pensions. And the other thing that we did, and again, another thing between Senator President Sweeney and Governor Christie, again, a bipartisan approach, is we started on a quarterly payment for the state, which I know only a handful of other states also have, and we didn't have previously. So what would happen in the state of New Jersey, that we would always make our final payment on the last day of the budget cycle, and then we only made as much as we could with the money that we had left at that time, which created lots and lots of problems. So for the last 5-6 years now, we've been making quarterly pension payments, where the biggest chunk is still at the end of the year, but we make pension payments along the way. And as you collect, certainly we'll start earning interest, right? And better interest in making those investments the sooner that we make it. So that's been a much better way, we think, to approach it, and gets us to make sure we're making as much of the pension payment, regardless of the fiscal situation, as the year goes on.
Yeah. How about in Kentucky, Representative Massey?
We had a little bit different scenario in Kentucky, in that we had actually, through our legislative, the General Assembly, had actually made what was the legally required contribution rates. The problem is that the cost of the programming, the cost of the coverage, kept going higher and higher. And so that deficit continued to build, and this has happened over a number of years. So when we put our committee together, one thing we did is, not only did we go to all of those heads of groups like I talked about, but we also encompassed the Senate and the House, which I thought was very beneficial, because a lot of times you have a General Assembly, but you have the chambers pushing against one another. So I know that one of the senators that was on that committee is listening on the call today, Senator Higdon, and he has been in the Senate for a number of years, and this has been something near and dear to his heart. So by bringing that together, we were able to basically have a plan together ahead of the session. We didn't file it early because we were actually making changes even as the session started. But what we were looking at is, how do we stop the bleeding? Because with the cost continuing to rise, if we continue to add more and more teachers, in our case, to this pension load, then it was just going to continue to spiral upwards and become an even greater deficit than we already had. So by creating this new tier that was fully funded, we are no longer adding to that load. We still have to deal with that unfunded legacy deficit, but it's not going to be as bad as it would have been inevitably had we not taken this kind of action. So one of the things that we've learned is that you try to solve problems as you go along. Some people believed it didn't go far enough as far as trying to incorporate this hybrid plan. But the thing is if we had people on board and we were having a consensus around it, so we were able to take what we could get for right now, knowing that there's some uncertainty that's coming down the road with regards to this pandemic. So I did make an error. My earlier statement made me think about this. we initially started with 30 years experience at age 55. And one of the changes they made is raising that to 57.
Mm.
And they did that because they wanted to bring it into alignment with the other tiers throughout the state. So one of the things you really are trying to look at is from a parity perspective, how do we do this fairly across the board to take care of our employees, those employees that we need, that are integral to our state's success, but not create more burden going into the future. And I think that's the biggest concern we had. You know, the lottery system in Kentucky is a little different. That goes to our KEYS program, which is a educational scholarship initiative. But we're trying to get sports betting passed with the idea that some of those revenues would go to help pay this underfunded legacy deficit that currently exists.
So one of the interesting things that both of you raised and have in common is this concept of, at a bare minimum, holding debt constant as opposed to letting it continue to grow and chipping away at the debt over time through a variety of different measures that are state specific. And that sounds a lot like one of the concepts or definitions of success that we at Pew kind of talk about. You know, how do you manage legacy debt? How do you manage fiscal sustainability given legacy debt? And at least stopping the bleeding is an obvious answer to that question. And then obviously how you spend down that debt over time is also important. But beyond managing debt, can I ask you both to kind of weigh in a little bit on other ways that you define success as you deliberate over the design and policies for your pension systems?
Well, one of the things that I would define as success in this past year for us is that there had been such a divide, such a chasm that had been created between those state employees and the General Assembly. You know, it got to be where it was like a stalemate that, you know, no matter what you brought forward was going to be tossed aside or raised as a barrier to kind of any successful negotiation. And so we knew that we had to try to rebuild some of those relationships. So by putting this group together, it was a large group, but by putting the group together, and we didn't do it as a task force or an ordained work group. It's just a group of folks that said, you know what, we got to fix this. So we all got together and worked on it together. So by doing that, the work itself was done out of the public eye. But when it came together so the public could see it and weigh in on it, we already had this plan in process, and we were able to answer those questions and rebuild some of this trust that had been lost. So to me personally, one of the greatest victories was trying to bring the groups back together so that they could have an intelligent conversation about how we solve a problem. Because this is no doubt a problem, not just in Kentucky, but many other states. And there's a lot of factors, you know, in the past, a lot of the finger pointing was back and forth. Well, it was the legislature's fault because they didn't fund it, or it was the teacher's fault because they wanted too much. And when we did that mistake where we went to 27 years, they should have spoke up then. And I tried to bring it to the point of, look, we can't undo the past, but we need to take the problem we have and we need to all contribute and take ownership of it and move it forward. So with every one of those groups in the Senate and the House taking some ownership of this product, I think we had some successful discussions. And some people even said, even if this doesn't pass, we've already had some success because we've started these conversations. Passing it just made it that much better because we know that there's still work to be done, but now we have the mechanism in place to work on it.
Kevin, do you have a different perspective in terms of New Jersey or anything to add to?
Yeah, a little bit. Actually, I was listening to Representative Massey. You could be listening to the Senate President. He put together a group not too dissimilar than what it sounds like was done in Kentucky. We call it an economic and fiscal policy group, of which is what really created as a policy, among other things, what was the hybrid pension plan and looking at that and what we can do. I mean, you know, looking at success on these things are hard. But as the representative said, sometimes getting the issue out there and in the public conversation is what's important. And the Senate President went from taking his group, and it was a group about 30 experts, legislators, economists, public finance experts, CPAs were on it. And we were looking at, anyway, all that and developing the hybrid plan. But he took that stuff and what we went from the economic fiscal policy group to what we called the path to progress. And we went around the state and, talked about what these issues are. And we held town halls, and listen, the public employees came out in droves and really were pushing against us as though this was an attack on them, and which it was not, right? I mean, this is just an area of major concern. And if we're spending $7 billion a year in New Jersey only on pensions out of a $42 billion budget, that's a significant portion of our budget right now that's going to pensions and is growing. Had we not even done the changes that we pushed back, it would be even greater of an obligation. So yeah, it's hard to measure success other than you chipping it away. But I agree that getting it out there and having the public understand, what we're facing and what this means, that's the most important part. And the representative said it well. We had the same thing in New Jersey. It was everybody's fault. It was the employees' fault. It was the legislators' fault. It was the governor's fault. It's everybody's fault. But guess what? It's all of our problems at the same time. So
Right. Building that coalition and public understanding is an important part of any reform. We have about 15 minutes left, and I'd love to be able to open up the question and answer session to the broader group of participants. I don't see any questions from the group in the chat box, but Anna, can we open up the full panel, including Alina and Elizabeth, to questions from our audience? I can continue to ask questions of Representative Massey and Kevin Drennan if needed, but would love to open it up to everybody else if there are questions.
Susan, I'm not seeing any, so why don't you go ahead and continue your conversation with Representative Massey and Kevin, and as we have folks come in, we will certainly alert you if they've got questions.
Super. I have two different questions that are somewhat unrelated, but why don't I start with Representative Massey, since Kevin looks like he's otherwise engaged. If that's okay with you, Representative.
It's fine, yes.
So on the horizon, I mean, both you and Kevin mentioned, that, the process is not over and it's an ongoing one. And so what are you looking at for the future now? And I guess I would also add, somewhat unrelatedly, are there other metrics or measures or information that you think the general public or policymakers themselves require to make that process, more smooth or just more well-informed?
Well, to answer that, candidly, Kentucky's had a lot of issues that we're dealing with. On the heels of this, there was a pretty divisive bill regarding what they called educational opportunity accounts. And whether you agree with that or disagree with that, the concern is that we are funded in Kentucky under a SEEK formula. And so, and what that means is seeking excellent education in Kentucky. For those that don't know, Kentucky's entire educational system was declared unconstitutional in 1990. And so we've been building that back since that time around equity and adequacy. So the real piece to deal with and negotiate is, it's not just about the pension piece. It's also about creating environments where you can continue to get people that want to come to your state and work. What I will say is Kentucky has been blessed with a lot of economic development. In fact, Amazon has moved into my neighborhood and will have the second largest one-story building in the world.
Oh my God.
And Amazon Prime is based here at the airport, as well as DHL, which is a courier service. So those people are going to bring families and going to bring students. And so when they bring students, we've got to have schools for them. And we know, and this is my educational piece coming through, that the number one component is a quality teacher in the classroom in order to influence education. And we're trying to train the workers for these jobs that some of them are not even developed yet. So to get to compete economically in our state, it's imperative that we get this, not only the pension problem under control, but we also look at all of these other aspects of education around it. And the education opportunity accounts, what that is if a school, if a student is not getting the services they need in a school, then they will be able to get essentially a credit or a voucher, if you will, and apply that towards a private school, which is fine. I'm not saying that there's not some validity to that. But what I am saying is that you're going to create a competition or divide between public and private. And traditionally, you could also create a chasm between the rich and the poor, and Kentucky is a poor state. So that being said, we have a lot of poverty areas in Kentucky. So I think part of the challenge for the legislature is to try to work all of this together. Because I can tell you in the chamber, when we called the bill, the pension bill, the other bill that was called right on the heels of that was the educational opportunity accounts. So part of the issue is, on one hand, you're asking teachers to work longer and pay more. And on the other hand, foreseeably, you could be taking some money that would normally go into your education system and redirecting it elsewhere, which might have a purpose. But it's just the balancing and the public perception of all of that. I mean, the goal should be that every child gets an appropriate education. And certainly if the school district is not doing that, then the parent or the taxpayer, if you will, should be able to intervene in those circumstances. But how do you do that in a sustainable way that will keep your public schools that have a duty to provide that public education to all kids? How do you keep those sustainable if you're redirecting money away? So it's just been a very interesting discussion, to be candid. I tell people that you need to be aware that those kind of discussions are coming. But if we're going to keep good employees, we're going to take care of our police, our firefighters, our teachers, et cetera, then the first thing you have to deal with is their ability to take care of their families so they can go about their jobs and take care of our children while we're trying to grow the economy in Kentucky. So that's kind of a long-winded answer. But the reason I put that together is I think that sometimes we don't realize you feel all the success of getting a bill through, and then you realize there are so many other components of what you're doing in the state that affect that bill, or that bill affects.
Before I move on to Kevin to answer the same question, I do have a Kentucky specific question from Ben Dawson, who asks, is it correct did he hear you correctly, Representative Massey, that employee contributions are not returned to them if they leave before hitting 5 years?
Not correct. Anything that they
contribution?
contribute, they can take with them. If they leave before 5 years, it's just what they have contributed. But if they leave after 5 years, they get what they contributed plus what the state has contributed plus interest on that money.
Super. So the correct answer is employee contributions at any time, employer contributions with interest after 5 years.
That's correct.
Thank you. Terrific. Now, Kevin, I don't know if you heard the question.
I didn't. I apologize. So if you don't mind repeating it.
Your day job is an important consideration. Those legislators, as we know, need their answers when they need them. The question was, given that both of you had discussed kind of chipping away at the problem over time, despite the fact that you guys have engaged in pretty serious reform very recently, what improvements in policy and practices are you most looking for going forward? And as somewhat of a caveat to that question, do you feel like you have the information from the plan and so on to speak to that process adequately? In other words, are there other measures or metrics or information that you feel would be useful to the legislature or the public writ large? Is information adequate for that process?
Yeah. So to answer, yeah, you asked sort of a dynamic question there. So
Sorry.
try to start backwards, right? But I mean, we absolutely could use more information. I mean, the frustration, I've been now executive director for roughly a decade. So, and while we've worked collaboratively with both administrations, you know, you sort of fly blind to an extent in the legislature with the information you have. And sometimes you don't know what questions to ask when you don't have any of the information to go on. And as we've come up with some ideas and pushed ideas, and a lot of that has come because of Senate President's experience, you know, we've done it in spite of that lack of accessibility to the data, so we could always use more. In addition, we hired our own actuary out of the Senate Majority Office as we approached this. Chiron happens to be the state's actuary, so we went with a former state actuary to avoid any conflicts in Milliman, and we've been very pleased with work, and they've been providing us a lot of guidance as we look at the data. But of course, you know, they're limited into the data that we're able to extract from the administration and from Treasury, and you know, about the pension system. So you know, it's not as though we get nothing, but oh, absolutely, we'd like to have more. And if we had more, or even if the administration, considering we do a lot of the work, it'd be great that this came from the division, or we have a division of pension and benefits, or came from Treasury. It's amazing how much of this effort has really been driven by the legislature over the years, when we aren't the ones with the information. The one thing we do know is the amount of debt that is out there. But you know, to the point, the reason why, to one of your, I think, earlier questions, right, on what we're looking at doing, one of the biggest reasons, right, for the hybrid approach for us isn't, as I said, because the savings is outward, it's not as great. It's the fact that we're coming into an area where people are not staying, even in government, staying in their jobs, and they need that portability, and they're looking for that portability. And if we're going to attract talent that moves in and out of government, something like a hybrid pension plan, which we don't currently have here in the state of New Jersey, you know, it doesn't give them that flexibility. And you really have to stay for long periods of time in state government to make your pension as valuable to you. And that's just not happening. So if we're going to attract the younger people, or even semi-younger people, to come in, even if they eventually think they're going to leave, we need a better retirement vehicle for them that we're not offering now. And I think that's extremely important. And that's what we're going to have to do, because we are losing, and you know, we continue to lose you know, our workforce. Most of our workforce has been here for 30 years or so. They're all retiring, and it's been very hard for the state to hire people, and it's going to continue. It's been hard for me to hire people. I mean, our salaries have gotten better competitively, but you know, we don't offer a 401k and a 401k match, and sometimes when you look at that, and I've been in and out of the government and the private sector, and I like my public pension, but I'll tell you, I would have taken a 401k in a heartbeat. My 401ks are outperforming my, you know, my pension almost every day of the week, I feel. So I would have loved to have more of the flexibility, even in a worker in my standpoint, but the people I hire, I'm lucky to have people for 3 years in the Senate Majority Office, and they're great while they're here, but they're moving on. And they're moving up and out, and I think having a portable option for a retirement plan would make that even more attractive for them to come into state government.
Yeah, that's a great point. Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
If I could add, one of the things that benefits this is that in our plan that we did this year, going to what he said, is that the plan makes it also attractive to people that come into the system later, people that might already have a retirement elsewhere. And so what we're getting is people that may look into education in our situation as a second career. And that's why when I said they can retire with 10 years experience at the age of 60 or 5 years at 65, then we're getting some very seasoned people that may be experts in their field that are now drawing a pension, a private pension, but are coming into the system, and there's an incentive for them to do so. One of the frustrations some teachers expressed during this process was, well, that's better than the system I got when I came into the system. And so the good thing is, though, it's helping us stabilize those employers and employees so that we can move forward. And I think that also kind of takes some of the edge off of just going in and making sweeping changes that have what people may perceive as a negative impact.
Yeah. So we're approaching the 3:15 mark, but I have two questions from the group that I'd love to squeeze in before we break. The first is a very quick follow-up to that question that you all just answered from Ben Dawson. Did the state perform any market research to gather data about exactly what potential millennials and Gen Z employees are looking for, and how did that shape your reforms, if so? So let's just start with really quick answers to that question. And then there was a follow-up question on hybrids, which I'd love to get to.
The
Real
quick
quick on
answer
that,
is,
I mean, that, I think I
Yeah.
answered it. It's exactly why we looked at the hybrid plan, because that's what in the research we did, that millennials and Gen Z employees were looking for, was portability.
and what we did is we put that information out to our educational groups and got their feedback regarding that. And that's kind of their input, is how that plan was shaped.
Fantastic. So that gives me maybe a minute to ask Elizabeth to maybe weigh in on a question from, hold on a second. I can't remember who asked this question, but could someone speak to the long run implications of hybrids and which state has the oldest hybrid? I'm not sure if they're talking about the long run implications from the standpoint of the government or the retiree, but Elizabeth, maybe you could start us off with an answer that touches on both.
Okay, so the oldest hybrid is the Texas Municipal Retirement System, which goes back to the 40s, right after the end of World War II. And it is a cash balance plan. It is a cash balance plan that has some very interesting features. They have, several hundred employers, and each employer is actually able to pick from a menu of provisions, which include both the employee rate, what rate the member matches it at, whether or not they have a COLA or a cost of living adjustment. And they actually have something that other cash balances generally don't, which is they can update the pay, because in a cash balance, it's like a DC and you're getting it paid in on your salary over the course of your career rather than your final average. And they have these provisions that allow it to update. It's a pretty healthy, well-run system that generally shows in kind of the good lists. I mean, in terms of long-term impact of hybrids, I don't think that anyone can give you a homogeneous answer, because it very much depends on what the provisions of that plan are, as well as the population that you're in. You could have a hybrid that would be very strong and meet the employer goals and also be something very valued by the membership, or you could have something that's not.
Yeah, Alina, do you want to add anything about any specific hybrid provisions that you feel, or Elizabeth yourself as well, that you feel are particularly impactful as a way of kind of backdooring an answer to that question?
I mean, I think that what we see about hybrid plans, I think, just to speak to the question of kind of portability, is that it becomes this nice balance, right, of providing a long-term, a good benefit for long-term career employees, while also a good benefit for workers who might stay 10, 15, or 20 years, right? Because depending on the type of hybrid, right? But if we're thinking about a side-by-side hybrid, or I think, that would combine a pension with a DC, you just kind of get a little bit of the best of both worlds, right? So workers who are going to stay for 10, 15 years, or, even 6 years, they've got their DC or 401k style plan. And then workers that are going to stay the long haul have kind of a nice blend of a pension, while also having the 401k that would benefit from, the high market returns, such.
Yeah, and I think South Dakota is often one that we talk about.
Right.
And in part, it's not because their provisions are right, because their provisions aren't going to be right for everyone. But what they did in terms of a process is they said, the cost that we're spending is kind of about where we want to be, the level of benefit, but our benefits we haven't updated for a while. We think that they're not necessarily what a more modern workforce and things is looking for. And so they went through and they systematically asked themselves, why are we offering it? What provisions do we want to get? And they went through and they looked at every provision and removed some and added some. And they ended up with a plan that's about the same costs, but everyone is generally happier with it. And one of the things that they have is for those shorter term employees, And most of the public systems, if you leave after a short period of time, you take just the employee contributions. They provide a portion, and it's whether or not you're vested, but some portion of the employer contributions, which is something we see in other systems like Colorado Para, where you can get. So I think that it's often the one that I point to when someone asks, how do you go about this? And it's not even that they got it perfect or right, but that the process was really implemented.
Yeah.
And I think just an example of a state that has adopted in this case, a variable defined benefit plan more recently is Maine, who adopted one for their local participating district, which was really underfunded. And they were coming at it from a slightly different perspective because they weren't in.
Disagreement.
Well, the PLD is one of my clients. They do not have a variable benefit. They have a variable contribution, and they also went through a process. The reason why I speak to South Dakota is it's larger, that it was only the local, but the changes that they made, they also went through and they eliminated some things, like there were some sick leave provisions that they got rid of. It changed some other outs, but it is the contribution that is now variable, because it used to be that the employees paid a set amount and then the employer absorbed everything. They now have a split that is a 58% to the employers, 42%, and then there's caps on it. The only part of it that's a variable benefit potentially, it is related to the COLA, and it's not so much a variable benefit, it's just there are COLA freezes possible if the contributions get to the caps. In terms of a variable benefit, I would think, when I hear that phrase, I think of Wisconsin being the only example in the public sector that's a variable benefit. There are some on the multi-employer side, but just as the person who did all that work, it's not a variable benefit plan.
Yes, no, right. Of course, you're the expert, Elizabeth, and I think just kind of our phrasing maybe is a little bit confusing there, and that's helpful. But one question to ask, just to follow up about Maine, have they reached the cap in the last couple of years? Has the COLA been impacted?
No,
or just the contribution side?
No, and they're not near it right now. At this point, we need a tail end event that's 3 standard deviations out to expect to be hitting that COLA cap. And so it was designed that way because it basically was an order of who's going to do the paying. Employers and actives can do it, but they really wanted to only impact the retirees if really necessary, because they have the least capacity to absorb.
Yeah.
And so that was part of the logic there. Actually, the contributions have gone down ever so slightly with the experience study.
Interesting. Well, we are well over time, and I as much as I enjoy a deep debate about the best way to implement hybrid, and there are just thousands of variations, I'm sure. I think this is a good breaking point. I will invite participants who have further questions to either contact us directly or contact Anna and her colleagues to pass them along to us, and we'd be happy to continue providing information. But I want to take this opportunity to thank Representative Massey and Kevin in his absence, as well as Elizabeth and Alina, and of course NCSL, for agreeing to participate in the session. Thank you very much. It's been great. And Anna, I'll turn it over for you to officially close us out, but thank you.
Sure thing. Well, thank you so much for sharing all your insights and expertise. Thank you to a terrific panel of speakers and to our attendees for taking the time to join us. I want to say a special thank you to the Pew Charitable Trust for their continued support. This session is being recorded, so you can access it after the fact. Please do submit any follow-up questions you have to the good folks at Pew or to us at NCSL. And finally, our last session in the spring fiscal briefing series is going to be next Wednesday, June 16th at 2 p.m. We're going to be looking at the state budget roller coaster throughout the pandemic. So I hope to see you next week. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.